Imagine a staring contest. Two people sit across from each other, eyes locked. Neither one wants to blink. They don't throw punches. They don't shout. But you can feel the tension, right? You know they are competing, trying to prove who is stronger, who can last longer. That, in a nutshell, was the Cold War. It was a giant planet-sized staring contest that lasted for more than 40 years. It wasn't a hot war with huge armies marching and clashing on a battlefield like World War II. Instead, it was a Cold War, a battle of ideas, threats, and sneaky moves. The two main players never directly declared war on each other because they knew a real fight would be too catastrophic for everyone. So, who were these two staring champions? On one side, you had the United States and its friends, often called the West. On the other side, you had the Soviet Union, a huge country made up of Russia and other states, and its allies, known as the East. After they worked together to defeat the bad guys in World War II, they looked at each other and realized they had very, very different ideas about how the world should work. It was like two kids who teamed up to build a Lego castle, but once it was done, they couldn't agree on who should be king or what the rules of the kingdom should be. This disagreement split the world in two. This wasn't a simple argument over who got the bigger slice of cake. This was a fundamental clash of civilizations. The United States believed in capitalism, where people and companies could own things, make money, and vote for their leaders in a democracy. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, believed in communism. In their system, the government owned everything, factories, farms, you name it, and made all the decisions for the people, with only one political party in charge. Each side was completely convinced that their way was the best and only way for humanity to prosper. They both wanted the rest of the world to join their team. This global competition turned into a massive game of influence. If one side built a new, powerful weapon, the other side had to build an even better one. If one side made a new friend in Africa or Asia, the other side would try to win over that country's neighbor. It was a chess match, played on a global scale where every move was watched, analyzed, and countered. The pieces in this game weren't just soldiers, they were spies, scientists, athletes, and even filmmakers. The whole world held its breath, watching these two superpowers circle each other, hoping that the staring contest wouldn't turn into a full-blown fistfight. Let's break down the two teams. Team USA was the captain of the Western Bloc. Think of them as the champions of democracy and capitalism. Their big idea was freedom, the freedom to start a business, the freedom to vote for different political parties, and the freedom of speech. They believed that individual people, not the government, should have the power to make their own choices and chase their own dreams. Their allies were countries in Western Europe like the United Kingdom, France, and West Germany, who formed a military club called NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The rule of this club was simple: if you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. On the other side of the field was Team USSR, captain of the Eastern Bloc. The USSR, or the Soviet Union, was a massive country led by Russia. Their big idea was communism. They believed that capitalism was unfair because it created a world of rich bosses and poor workers. Their solution? Get rid of private property. The government would own all the factories and farms, and everyone would work for the common good, sharing the resources equally. In theory, it sounded nice, but in practice, it meant a powerful, unelected government controlled everything. Their allies were countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. They had their own military club called the Warsaw Pact. You can see why these two ideas just couldn't get along. Capitalism is all about competition and individual success. Communism is all about cooperation and collective ownership, enforced by the state. The United States looked at the Soviet Union and saw a scary dictatorship that crushed people's freedom. The Soviet Union looked at the United States and saw a greedy, unequal society where the rich got richer and the poor were left behind. Neither side trusted the other one bit. They saw the world as a battleground between their competing visions for the future of humanity. This ideological battle was like a powerful magnet that pulled the rest of the world to one side or the other. A famous leader, Winston Churchill, said an iron curtain had fallen across Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. This wasn't a real curtain, of course. It was a metaphor for the heavily guarded border, the political hostility, and the deep mistrust that separated the two halves of the continent. For decades, this division defined global politics, influencing everything from trade deals to Olympic Games. Each side was determined to prove that their system was the superior one. Now, let's talk about the scariest part of this whole staring contest, the nuclear bomb. After the United States used atomic bombs to end World War II in 1945, the secret was out. Humanity had created a weapon so powerful it could wipe out an entire city in a flash. Soon, the Soviet Union figured out how to build one too, in 1949. This is when the Cold War went from being a tense competition to a terrifying standoff. Suddenly, both sides had a red button they could push to launch a nuclear attack. It was like two people standing in a room full of gasoline, and each one was holding a lit match. This created a very strange and frightening situation called mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. It's a fitting acronym, because the idea was completely insane. MAD meant that if the USA launched its nukes at the Soviet Union, the Soviets would still have enough time to launch their nukes back before the first ones hit. The result? Both countries, and probably the rest of the world, would be utterly destroyed. This terrible promise of total annihilation was, ironically, what kept the peace. Neither leader wanted to be the one to start a war that would end human civilization. So, the bombs were never used, but the fear was always there, hanging over everyone's head. Both the USA and the USSR entered a frantic arms race, building more and more nuclear weapons. They built bigger bombs, faster missiles to carry them, and submarines that could hide in the ocean and launch a surprise attack. We thought it was a race with no finish line. By the 1980s, there were tens of thousands of nuclear warheads in the world, enough to destroy our planet many times over. This constant threat of nuclear winter, a world plunged into darkness and freezing temperatures by the dust from nuclear explosions, made people everywhere very, very nervous. This constant danger forced leaders to be extremely careful. The closest the world ever came to nuclear war was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just a stone's throw away from Florida. When the United States discovered them, it led to a terrifying 13-day standoff. The world watched, petrified, as the two superpowers stood eyeball to eyeball. Thankfully, they managed to negotiate a peaceful solution at the last minute. The crisis was a wake-up call, showing everyone just how easily the Cold War could turn hot and end everything. Since the two superpowers couldn't fight a real war, they fought a secret one. This was the age of the spy, the secret agent, the master of disguise. Both the American CIA, which stands for Central Intelligence Agency, and the Soviet KGB, or Committee for State Security, were like the secret police and spy masters for their teams. Their job was to steal the other side's secrets, uncover their plans, and secretly influence events in other countries. It was a shadowy game of cat and mouse, played in back alleys, foreign embassies, and hidden radio rooms all over the globe. Fiction was filled with spies like James Bond, but the real-life stuff was just as dramatic. What kind of secrets were they after? Everything. They wanted to know about new weapons, military plans, and technological breakthroughs. A spy might be a charming diplomat who was actually listening to private conversations, or a quiet scientist who was secretly photographing blueprints. They used all sorts of clever gadgets, like cameras hidden in pens, microphones in shoe heels, and secret codes tucked inside hollowed-out coins. They also tried to recruit spies from the other side, promising them money, safety, or sometimes appealing to their beliefs to convince them to become a double agent and betray their own country. One simple example is how they gathered intelligence. The United States built a super-fast, high-flying spy plane called the U-2. It could fly so high that the Soviets couldn't shoot it down, or so they thought. For years, these planes flew over the Soviet Union, taking detailed pictures of military bases and missile sites. But, in 1960, the Soviets managed to shoot one down and captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers. It was a huge international embarrassment for the United States, which had been pretending the flights weren't happening. It showed just how risky and high stakes this secret war of espionage really was. This secret war wasn't just about stealing information, it was also about spreading misinformation. The KGB was famous for planting false stories in newspapers to make the United States look bad. The CIA, in turn, secretly funded radio stations, magazines, and even art exhibits to promote American values and paint a negative picture of communism. Spies were also involved in much darker activities, like helping to overthrow governments that were friendly to the enemy. This hidden conflict of espionage and subversion was a constant, invisible battlefront in the Cold War, shaping world events from behind the scenes. You know, the Cold War wasn't just fought with spies and weapons, it was also fought with science and rockets. This was, well, the space race, a competition between the USA and the USSR to see who could conquer the final frontier. And hey, it wasn't just about exploration, it was a battle for technological and ideological bragging rights. If the Soviet Union could put a satellite into orbit, it would prove the power of their communist system. On the other hand, if the United States could land a man on the moon, it would be a victory for capitalism and democracy. The whole world really was the audience for this cosmic contest. The race kicked off in 1957 when the Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1. A small, beeping metal sphere that became the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. For Americans, this was, a huge blow. It felt like they were falling behind in science and technology. The beeping of Sputnik from space sounded like a taunt, a signal that the communists were winning. The US government panicked and poured massive amounts of money into science education and its own space program, creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in 1958. The race was officially on. The Soviets scored several more early victories. They sent the first animal into orbit, a dog named Laika. And in 1961 they sent the first human, Yuri Gagarin, on a trip around the Earth. He became, a global hero and a powerful symbol of Soviet achievement. It seemed like the USSR was running away with the prize. In response, US President John F. Kennedy made a bold and daring promise in 1961. America would commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. It was an incredibly ambitious goal. This challenge, it galvanized the entire nation. For the next 8 years, thousands of scientists, engineers and technicians at NASA worked tirelessly on the Apollo program. They built giant rockets, designed complex spacecraft, and solved countless problems. Then, on July 20, 1969, the world watched on television as American astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped out of the Apollo 11 lunar module and became the first human to walk on the moon. His famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind," were more than just a statement. They were the finish line of the most exciting race in history, a monumental Cold War victory for the United States. Because the USA and the USSR were just too afraid to fight each other directly, thanks to those pesky nuclear bombs, they found another way to compete: proxy wars. A proxy war is when two powerful countries, fight by supporting opposite sides in a conflict in a third, smaller country. It's kind of like two schoolyard bullies getting other kids to fight for them, instead of getting their own hands dirty. The USA would back one side with money, weapons, and training, while the Soviet Union would back the other. This allowed them to compete for influence and weaken their rival without risking a direct, world-ending confrontation. One of the most famous and tragic proxy wars was the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. After World War II, Korea was split in two, a communist north, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and a capitalist south, supported by the United States and its allies. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, trying to unite the country under communist rule. The United States and other UN countries sent troops to defend the South, while the Soviets and Chinese aided the North. The war ended in a stalemate, with the country still divided along the same border, a division that exists to this day. Millions of people died, but the superpowers never fired a shot at each other. An even longer and more divisive proxy war was the Vietnam War. Similar to Korea, Vietnam was split between a communist north and a non-communist south. The United States became deeply involved, sending hundreds of thousands of troops to support South Vietnam and prevent it from falling to communism, a policy known as containment. The Soviet Union and China, meanwhile, supplied the North Vietnamese with weapons and aid. The war dragged on for years, causing immense suffering and becoming deeply unpopular back in America. In the end, the United States withdrew, and Vietnam was unified under communist rule in 1975, which was a major blow to American prestige. The Cold War superpowers turned many other local conflicts into proxy battlegrounds. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded in 1979 to support a friendly communist government. In response, the United States, through the CIA, secretly armed and trained local resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. This long and brutal war became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a costly failure that helped weaken it. From Angola to Nicaragua to the Middle East, the story was often the same. Local disputes were inflamed and prolonged by the interference of the two global rivals, leaving a legacy of instability and destruction. The Cold War wasn't just something that happened between world leaders and spies, it kind of seeped into the fabric of everyday life, especially in America. The constant fear of a surprise nuclear attack created a culture of anxiety. People built bomb shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned food and water, hoping they could survive a nuclear blast. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills. A friendly cartoon turtle named Bert would teach them to duck under their desks and cover their heads in case of a nuclear flash. It seems silly now, but at the time, it was a very real and serious preparation for what many thought was an inevitable attack. The media and entertainment industries were also powerful weapons in the Cold War. Hollywood produced movies that portrayed communists as evil villains and American heroes as brave defenders of freedom. Films like The Red Menace and Invasion of the USA stoked fears of a communist takeover. On the other side, Soviet cinema glorified communism and depicted capitalists as greedy and corrupt. Even comic books got in on the act, with superheroes like Captain America punching out communist bad guys. Propaganda was everywhere, constantly reminding people who the enemy was and why their own way of life was worth fighting for. This climate of fear also led to a dark chapter in American history, known as the Red Scare. A politician named Senator Joseph McCarthy launched a witch hunt for supposed communists hiding in the US government, in Hollywood, and in other parts of society. He accused people of being disloyal with little or no evidence, ruining many careers and lives. This period of intense suspicion, known as McCarthyism, showed how the fear of an external enemy could lead a country to turn on its own citizens, damaging the very freedoms it claimed to be protecting. It was a scary time when being different or having unpopular opinions could make you a target. But it wasn't all fear and paranoia. The Cold War competition, particularly the space race, spurred incredible technological innovation. The drive to beat the Soviets led to the development of technologies that we still use today. The creation of NASA and the massive government investment in science led to breakthroughs in microchips, computers, GPS, and satellite communications. Even things like memory foam mattresses and cordless tools have their roots in technology developed for the space program. So, in a strange way, the rivalry that threatened to destroy the world also helped to build the modern, connected world we live in. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was in deep trouble. Decades of the arms race and massive military spending had crippled its economy. The communist system, which was supposed to create a workers' paradise, was failing to produce enough basic goods for its people. Store shelves were often empty, and citizens had to wait in long lines for bread or shoes. While the West was experiencing a boom in consumer goods and technology, the Eastern Bloc was stagnating. The people living under Soviet control were growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of freedom and prosperity that they could see on Western television and in movies. A new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in 1985 and realized that things had to change. He introduced two radical new policies: glasnost, which meant more openness and freedom of speech, and perestroika, which meant restructuring the economy to make it more efficient. He hoped these reforms would save the Soviet system, but instead, they opened the floodgates. Once people got a taste of freedom, they wanted more. Gorbachev also signaled that the Soviet Union would no longer use its army to prop up the communist governments in Eastern Europe. This was a game changer. The most powerful symbol of the Cold War's division was the Berlin Wall, a concrete barrier that split the city of Berlin in two and stopped East Germans from escaping to the west. For decades, it stood as a brutal monument to communist oppression. But in 1989, inspired by the new spirit of freedom, massive protests erupted across East Germany. On the incredible night of November 9, 1989, the overwhelmed East German government announced that its citizens were free to cross the border. Thousands of people swarmed the wall, cheering, crying, and using hammers and pickaxes to tear it down. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the symbolic end of the Iron Curtain. The collapse of the wall set off a chain reaction. One by one, the communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries fell, mostly peacefully. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. Without its empire and its unifying ideology, the Soviet Union itself began to crumble. The different republics that made up the USSR started declaring their independence. Finally, in December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The 4-decade-long staring contest was over. The United States and the West had won the Cold War, not with a bang, but with the quiet fizzle of a system that had run out of steam. So, the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is gone, and we don't have duck and cover drills anymore. Why should we still care about this long, strange conflict? Well, for one, the ghost of the Cold War still haunts our world today. Many of the international borders and political hotspots we see on the news are a direct result of Cold War decisions. The division of Korea into a communist North and a capitalist South is a frozen relic of that era. The ongoing conflicts in the Middle East were often made worse by the USA and USSR, using the region as a chessboard for their own rivalry. The world we inherited was shaped in the furnace of this global competition. The Cold War also left us with some very important and very scary leftovers. Thousands of nuclear weapons. Even though the USA and Russia have reduced their arsenals, they and other countries still possess enough nuclear firepower to cause unimaginable devastation. The threat of these weapons falling into the wrong hands or being used in a regional conflict is still one of the biggest dangers facing humanity. The lessons of mutually assured destruction and the close calls like the Cuban Missile Crisis are more important than ever. They remind us that diplomacy and communication are essential to preventing a catastrophe. Furthermore, the Cold War taught us a lot about the power of ideas. It was a battle between two completely different ways of organizing society: democracy versus authoritarianism, and capitalism versus communism. That larger struggle hasn't gone away. Today we still see tensions between countries that value individual freedoms and open societies, and those that are run by powerful central governments that control the media and suppress dissent. Understanding the Cold War helps us understand the arguments and values that are still competing for influence on the global stage. It helps us appreciate the freedoms we have and the importance of defending them. Finally, the Cold War is a powerful story of how humanity can be pushed to its very best and its very worst. It drove us to the brink of self-destruction, fueled paranoia, and caused immense suffering in proxy wars. But it also pushed us to reach for the moon, to connect the world with satellites, and to develop technologies that have transformed our lives. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, suspicion, and ideological rigidity. But it's also a hopeful story that shows how even the most fortified walls can come tumbling down, and how a long, dark standoff can end not in fire, but in a celebration of freedom.